Sweat dripped from the rusted rafters of the ironclad gym, freezing mid-air as the entire room went dead silent. A 310-pound behemoth had just spat on the legacy of a martial arts god. The smaller man standing opposite him didn't flinch. He just exhaled. 5 seconds later, the giant would fall. The ironclad gym sat like a concrete bunker on the bruised edge of Chicago's South Side. It was a place devoid of mirrors, air conditioning, or ego-stroking juice bars. Men came here to hit and be hit. It was a Tuesday evening in late November, the kind of night where the wind off Lake Michigan felt like shattered glass against the skin, and the gym was packed. Holding court in the center of the heavy bag area was William Big Bill Sterling. Bill was a terrifying specimen of modern underground combat. Standing 6'4" and tipping the scales at an uncompromising 310 pounds. He was less a man and more a runaway freight train made of muscle, bone, and bad intentions. He had just returned from a devastating victory over Arthur Pendleton in a bare-knuckle heavyweight clash in Detroit, a fight that ended in 90 seconds with Pendleton leaving on a stretcher. Bill was riding the highest wave of his career, flush with cash, adrenaline, and an intoxicating level of arrogance. Simon Hayes, Bill's manager, a weasel of a man in a cheap pinstripe suit, was wiping the heavyweight's brow with a dirty towel. "You're untouchable, Bill. Nobody moved like you at that weight." "Nobody," Bill grunted, admiring his bruised knuckles. His eyes, small and cruel, wandered around the gym looking for validation from the other fighters who were pretending to hit the speed bags while secretly watching him. His gaze landed on the far wall near the water fountain. Pinned haphazardly against the exposed brick was a faded, black-and-white poster of Bruce Lee, captured mid-kick from Enter the Dragon. The poster had been there since the gym opened in the 80s, a silent guardian over the canvas. Bill scoffed, a sound like a diesel engine turning over. He walked over to the poster, his massive footfalls vibrating the wooden floorboards. "Look at this," Bill bellowed, pointing a taped sausage-like finger at the image. "People worship this guy. It's pathetic. The original Hollywood fraud." The rhythmic thud of jump ropes and the slapping of leather gloves against mitts slowed to a halt. The gym fell into an uneasy hush. Derek Reynolds, the grizzled owner of Ironclad, who had seen his fair share of broken jaws and broken dreams, paused, sweeping the chalk off the floor. "Leave it alone, Bill," Derek rasped, leaning on his broom. "It's just a poster." "It's a lie, Derek," Bill shot back, his voice echoing off the corrugated tin roof. He turned to face the gym, loving the captive audience. Bruce Lee was a dancer, an actor. He weighed, 130 pounds? If he stepped into a real cage with a real fighter, he'd be snapped in half. You put me in a room with Bruce Lee in his prime and I'd literally eat him. All that chi, all that philosophy, it's fake. Bruce Lee is fake. He ripped the poster off the wall. The brittle paper tore with a sharp, ugly sound. Bill crumpled the iconic image into a ball and tossed it into a nearby trash can. "Size matters. Strength matters," Bill sneered. "Fairy tales don't win fights." In the back corner of the gym, sitting on a wooden bench wrapping his hands, was Thomas Caldwell. Thomas Tommy, to the few who knew him, was not a heavyweight. He stood 5'9" and weighed 165 pounds, soaking wet. He possessed an unassuming physique, lean, compact, and completely unremarkable when hidden beneath his oversized gray sweatpants and worn-out hoodie. He was a quiet fixture at Ironclad, an aerospace engineer by day who came in late, hit the heavy bag with frightening rhythmic precision, and left without saying much. But Tommy had a history that wasn't printed on his gym membership card. His father had been stationed in California in the late 60s, and had been one of the very few private students to train out of a legendary garage in Oakland. Tommy was raised not just on the physical mechanics of Jeet Kune Do, but on the absolute unyielding philosophy of it. He understood the biomechanics of power generation better than most physicists. Tommy finished tucking the end of his cotton hand wrap. He stood up, You shouldn't have done that, Bill, Tommy said. His voice wasn't loud, but in the dead silence of the gym, it carried like a gunshot. Bill turned slowly, his thick neck creaking. He looked down at Tommy, a bewildered sneer forming on his face. "Excuse me, did the librarian just speak?" Simon Hayes chuckled nervously, stabbing behind his massive fighter. "Let it go, Bill. He's a nobody. Probably just a movie fan." Tommy walked out from the shadows of the corner, stepping under the harsh fluorescent lights of the main floor. He stopped 10 feet from the heavyweight champion. "He wasn't a god," Tommy said, his tone infuriatingly level. "He was a man who understood physics, leverage, and the human anatomy better than anyone else in his era. You rely on mass and gravity, Bill. But mass is a liability if you don't know how to anchor it. And gravity works on you just as hard as it works on me." Bill let out a roaring laugh, slapping his massive thigh. "Listen to this guy. Physics. Leverage. Tell you what, Einstein. Why don't you come into the ring and give me a physics lesson? Let's see if your dead Hollywood hero can save you from a 300-pound reality check." Derek stepped between them, holding up his hands. "Enough. Tommy, go back to your bag. Bill, you had your fun. We don't do unsanctioned sparring here with that kind of weight discrepancy. It's murder. I accept," Tommy said quietly. Derek stared at Tommy, his eyes wide. "Are you insane, Caldwell? He'll kill you. He's twice your size." "He's slow," Tommy replied, never breaking eye contact with Bill. "And he's angry. Anger makes you blind. I just need him to sign a waiver." Ta-ta! The tension in the room morphed into a bizarre, electric anticipation. Sarah Jenkins, a freelance sports journalist who was there profiling Derek for a local magazine, discreetly pulled out her phone and hit record. She knew she was either about to witness a tragic, brutal mismatch or something entirely unbelievable. 15 minutes later, the ring ropes had been tightened. The doors to the ironclad gym had been deadbolted from the inside by Derek, who was sweating profusely, terrified of the liability, but too captivated by the sheer primal energy of the room to stop it. Waivers hastily scribbled on the back of gym flyers was signed. Bill Sterling stood in the red corner, rolling his massive shoulders. He had stripped off his shirt, revealing a torso covered in thick hair and faded prison tattoos. His muscles were swollen with blood, his chest heaving. He looked like a mythological troll ready to crush a villager. Simon was massaging his traps, whispering vicious encouragements. "Take his head off in the first exchange," Simon hissed. "Make an example out of him. Show them what happens when a nobody talks back to the king." In the blue corner, Tommy Caldwell stood perfectly still, and he hadn't taken off his hoodie. He wasn't bouncing on his toes. He wasn't psyching himself up. His breathing was so slow and shallow it was almost imperceptible. He looked like a man waiting for a bus, not a man about to face a giant. This absolute stillness was the first twist of the knife in Bill's psyche. Bullies, even professional ones, rely on fear. They feed on the flinch, the nervous blinking, the backing away. Tommy was giving him nothing. The void of emotion was terrifying in its own way. Bill slammed his gloves together, a loud smack echoing in the gym, trying to startle the smaller man. Tommy slowly blinked. Derek stood in the center of the canvas, acting as the makeshift referee. "All right, listen up," Derek said, his voice trembling slightly. "No elbows to the back of the head. No eye gouges. When I say break, you break. If I see this getting out of hand, I'm calling it immediately, and if you don't stop, I'm calling the cops. Understood? Just ring the damn bell, Derek." Bill growled, his mouth guard turning his words to mush. Tommy simply nodded. "Touch gloves," Derek commanded. They met in the center. Bill reached out with a heavy leather glove and intentionally shoved Tommy's hands hard, trying to off-balance him before the fight even began. It was a dirty, classic intimidation tactic. But Tommy's feet didn't move. He absorbed the kinetic energy through his shoulders, sinking his weight into his hips, and let the force bleed into the floor. He remained rooted to the spot like an old oak tree. Bill's eyes widened fractionally. For the first time, a microscopic seed of doubt planted itself in his brain. Shoving a 160-pound man with that much force should have sent him stumbling backward. It defied logic. "Back to your corners," Derek shouted, slicing his hand through the air between them. "Wait for the bell." The crowd of fighters, trainers, and onlookers pressed tightly against the ring apron. The air was thick, suffocating. Sarah Jenkins held her breath, her camera focused tight on the two men. Ding. The bell echoed loudly. What followed is still talked about in hushed, reverent tones in the dark corners of Chicago's fighting circuit. It did not take minutes. It did not take rounds. From the moment the bell rang to the moment the trajectory of Bill Sterling's life changed forever, exactly 5 seconds elapsed. Second one, Bill charged. He didn't bother with a jab or feeling out the distance. He abandoned all technique in favor of sheer, overwhelming mass. He launched his 310-pound frame forward, throwing a looping, catastrophic right hook aimed directly at Tommy's temple. A punch like that didn't need to land clean. Even clipping the guard would be enough to cause a concussion. The floorboards of the ring literally bowed under Bill's charging weight. Second two, Tommy didn't retreat. That was Bill's second and fatal miscalculation. Anyone else would have stepped back to avoid the freight train, which is exactly what a brawler wants. They want you on your heels, trapped against the ropes. Instead, Tommy stepped in, moving with a liquid grace that completely belied the violence of the moment. Tommy slipped his head a fraction of an inch to the left. The massive wind of Bill's right hook ruffled the fabric of Tommy's hoodie as it sailed harmlessly over his shoulder. By stepping inside the arc of the punch, Tommy had entered the eye of the hurricane, the one place Bill's long, heavy arms couldn't reach him effectively. Second three, Bill, having missed his target and committed all his forward momentum to the punch, was momentarily off balance, his right side completely exposed. He was a runaway train that had just missed the station. Tommy pivoted his lead foot, anchoring himself to the canvas. In the philosophy of Jeet Kune Do, power does not come from the arm. It comes from the earth, travels up the leg, through the hip, and is delivered by the fist. Tommy's hip snapped with explosive, terrifying torque. He delivered a short, sharp, lead, straight, puncher-modified vertical fist directly into the floating ribs on Bill's exposed right side. Crack. The sound was sickening, like a thick, dry branch being snapped over a knee. It wasn't a muffled thud of a glove hitting muscle, it was the acoustic resonance of bone giving way. Second fall. The pain receptors in Bill's brain screamed, but his forward momentum was still carrying him. His huge body shuddered, his mouth opening in a silent gasp as the air was violently forced from his lungs. His left arm dropped, instinctually trying to protect his shattered ribs. Tommy was already flowing into his next movement. Using the recoil from the body shot, he shifted his weight seamlessly to his back leg. His right hand whipped upward in a blistering, perfectly calculated uppercut. This wasn't a wild, looping punch. It was a surgical strike, traveling less than 10 inches, driven by the kinetic chain of a man who had practiced this exact motion 50,000 times in an empty garage. The punch connected flush with the point of Bill Sterling's heavy jaw. Second 5, the human brain sits suspended in fluid inside the skull. When the jaw is struck with sufficient upward and rotational force, the brain violently twists and impacts the side of the cranium, causing an immediate, uncontrollable shutdown of the central nervous system. It does not matter if the man weighs 100 pounds or 400 pounds. Biology is an absolute dictator. Bill Sterling's eyes rolled back into his head, showing only the whites. The sneer, the arrogance, the sheer imposing will of the giant vanished in a microsecond. His 310-pound body suddenly lost all structural integrity. He fell forward like a demolished skyscraper collapsing into its own footprint. He hit the canvas face first with a concussive boom that shook the dust from the rafters and rattled the teeth of everyone standing at ringside. He didn't twitch. He didn't roll over. He was out cold before his face even hit the mat. The 5 seconds were over. The silence inside the ironclad gym was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. It was the kind of silence that follows a catastrophic car crash, a collective suspension of breath as the human brain struggles to process an event that entirely defies its understanding of reality. On the sweat-stained canvas, the 310-pound behemoth lay motionless. He looked entirely deflated, a terrifying titan reduced to a broken heap of flesh and bone in the span of 5 seconds. A thin line of crimson began to pool beneath his shattered jaw. Derek Reynolds was the first to break the paralysis. He scrambled under the ropes, his knees hitting the mat with a thud, and pressed 2 trembling fingers against the giant's thick neck. "He's alive," Derek gasped, his voice cracking, but his pulses erratic. "Call an ambulance, now." Chaos erupted. The spell broke, and the gym descended into a frenzy of shouts and frantic movement. Simon, the manager who just minutes ago had been demanding a brutal execution, was now hyperventilating against the turnbuckle. His face was the color of wet ash. The invincible golden goose, the fighter who was supposed to punch his ticket to the $1 million underground leagues, had been dismantled by an aerospace engineer in sweatpants. Thomas Caldwell did not cheer. He did not raise his arms in victory, nor did he look down at the fallen giant with malice. He simply exhaled a long, measured breath, stepped calmly over the ropes, and walked back to his wooden bench in the shadowy corner of the gym. He sat down and methodically began unwrapping the cotton tape from his hands. Rachel Adams, the freelance sports reporter who had been pinned against the apron, stared at the screen of her camera. Her hands were shaking violently. She rewound the digital footage, her thumbs swiping back to the moment the bell rang. She played it back, then she played it again at half speed. Then at quarter speed, what she saw was not a lucky punch. It was a terrifying, beautiful application of biomechanical science. She watched the giant commit all his mass into a wild, lunging hook. She watched Thomas slick the punch by a fraction of a millimeter. And then she saw the counter. Later, when she would consult a sports kinesiologist to break down the footage for her exclusive article, the sheer mathematical brutality of the strike would be laid bare. The kinesiologist would explain it using absolute physics. The rotational torque applied to the giant's jaw was calculated using the equation tau equals R times F times, where $R was the distance from the pivot point of the neck, and $F was the staggering force generated by Thomas's anchored hip rotation. Furthermore, the kinetic energy transferred into the giant's floating ribs. The blow that shattered bone followed the principal K. Fraf, one tus, nub, MV2, Because Thomas's fist was moving at an exceptional velocity, squared in the equation, the resulting energy transfer was equivalent to being struck by a baseball bat swung by a professional player. It was the ultimate demonstration of hard karma. The heavyweight had mocked the science, the discipline, and the philosophy of the art, relying solely on his bullying mass. In return, the universe delivered through the fists of Thomas Caldwell used that exact mass against him. Paramedics burst through the heavy steel doors of the gym, their radios squawking. It took 3 of them, plus Derek and 2 other heavyweights, to roll the unconscious fighter onto a reinforced stretcher. As they reeled him out, the oxygen mask strapped to his face, the reality of the situation settled over the remaining crowd. Simon suddenly snapped out of his shock. Panic turned into desperate, venomous anger. He marched across the gym floor, pointing a trembling finger at Thomas, who was quietly sliding his gym bag over his shoulder. "You used something," Simon shrieked, his voice echoing off the tin roof. "You had a roll of quarters in your wrap. Or brass knuckles. There is no physical way a lightweight nobody drops a super heavyweight like that. I'm calling the police and having you arrested for assault." Thomas stopped. He turned slowly, his calm eyes meeting Simon's frantic, bloodshot gaze. "You signed a waiver, Simon." Derek witnessed the rap. There was nothing but cotton and tape. "Liar," Simon spat, stepping closer, though he wisely kept out of arm's reach. "You've ruined him. Do you know who had money on his next fight? Do you have any idea the kind of people you just crossed?" "I didn't cross anyone," Thomas said softly, the unwavering calm in his voice more intimidating than any threat. "He crossed a line of disrespect. He believed his size gave him the right to rewrite the truth. And that never lies, Simon. It only reveals what is already there." Rachel Adams stepped forward, holding up her digital camera. "He didn't use a weapon, Simon. I have the entire thing in high definition, shot at 120 frames per second. It was clean. It was perfect. And it's going to be the front page of every fighting blog in the world by tomorrow morning." Simon blanched. He looked at the camera, then at Thomas, and realized with crushing certainty that his lucrative empire of intimidation was entirely, irrevocably over. 2 days later, the fallout was absolute. Rachel Adams kept her word. The video, titled simply "The 5-Second Lesson," exploded across the internet. It bypassed the sports world and became a global cultural phenomenon. Martial arts grandmasters analyzed it. Physicists wrote papers on it. Arrogant fighters across the globe fell into a nervous silence. For the giant, the hard karma was absolute and devastating. He awoke in a hospital room with a shattered jaw wired shut, 3 broken ribs, and a severe concussion. When he was finally allowed to look at his phone, he saw the video. He watched himself, the imposing bully, fall like a felled tree. The sponsors vanished overnight. The sycophants who had fed his ego stopped answering his texts. Left alone in the sterile quiet of his hospital room, he was forced to confront the horrifying reality that his entire identity had been built on a fragile illusion of invincibility. But the viral fame brought a different, far more dangerous complication for Thomas Caldwell. Simon had not been lying about the people who had money invested in the heavyweight's violent rise. The underground fighting circuit in Chicago was largely bankrolled by the Rostov family, a sophisticated, ruthless syndicate that treated human combatants like racehorses. Viktor Rostov, the patriarch, had lost a staggering sum of untraceable money due to the 5-second knockout. On a rainy Thursday evening, as Thomas was leaving his engineering firm, a sleek, armored black town car pulled up to the curb, blocking his path. The back door opened. Stepping out into the Chicago rain under a black silk umbrella was Isabella Rostov. She was a striking contrast to the brutal world her family controlled. Dressed in a tailored charcoal trench coat, her dark hair pulled back severely, she possessed an icy, calculating beauty. She was Lictor's youngest daughter, and rumor had it she was the true architect of the family's financial operations. "Thomas Caldwell," she said. Her voice was smooth, carrying a faint, aristocratic European accent. "You are a very difficult man to find." Thomas didn't step back. He assessed the heavy-set driver standing near the trunk, noting the unmistakable bulge of a shoulder holster. "I wasn't hiding." Isabella stepped closer. The scent of expensive, dark perfume cut through the smell of the wet asphalt. She looked up at him, her dark eyes analyzing the unassuming engineer who had dismantled her family's prized heavy hitter. There was no anger in her gaze, only a deep, smoldering curiosity. "My father is a man who demands a return on his investments," Isabella said, her voice dropping to a conversational murmur intended only for him. "You destroyed a very expensive asset of ours. Standard protocol would dictate that my driver break both of your hands." "Then why are we talking?" Thomas asked, his heart rate remaining infuriatingly steady. Isabella smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of her lips. She was entirely unaccustomed to men who didn't flinch in her presence. "Because I convinced him that a man who can generate that much kinetic energy is worth far more with his hands intact. We're launching a new, elite underground circuit. No blobs, no weight classes, only the absolute best. We want you as the headline fighter. The contract will make you a millionaire in 6 months. It was a proposition wrapped in a threat, the classic syndicate maneuver. But as Isabella looked into Thomas's eyes, she felt a strange, unsettling shift in her own chest. She lived in a world of greedy, violent, predictable men. Thomas was a void. He was disciplined, principled, and utterly detached from the lure of power or money. It was intoxicating. "No," Thomas said simply. Isabella's smile faded. "Excuse me?" "Martial arts is the expression of the human body, a path to honest self-knowledge," Thomas replied, stepping around the puddle between them. "It is not a spectacle for gamblers. I fight to defend the truth, not to entertain your father's associates. Keep your money." He walked past her. The driver instantly reached inside his jacket, stepping forward to intercept. "Stand down," Isabella snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. The driver froze. Isabella turned, watching Thomas walk away into the rain. She should have been furious at the disrespect. She should have ordered him dragged into the car. Instead, her heart beat with a frantic, unfamiliar rhythm. For the first time in her heavily guarded, violently orchestrated life, she had found someone she could not buy, intimidate, or control. The refusal didn't anger her, it captivated her. Over the next 3 months, Isabella Rostov became a silent shield for Thomas. Without his knowledge, she dismantled her father's plans for retaliation, maneuvering syndicate resources away from the engineer out of the profound, secretive respect and a blossoming, dangerous romantic obsession. She watched him from afar, protecting the quiet martial artist from the shadows of the criminal underworld he had inadvertently bruised. And as the snow began to fall over Chicago in late December, the final piece of hard karma settled into place. Thomas was alone in the ironclad gym, hitting the heavy bag with rhythmic, thundering strikes, the sound echoing through the empty building. The steel door creaked open. Thomas stopped the bag, turning around. Standing in the doorway, bundled in a heavy winter coat, was the behemoth. He had lost 30 pounds. His jaw was fully healed, but his eyes were entirely different. The cruel arrogance had been burned away, replaced by a quiet, heavy humility. The giant walked slowly across the gym floor, stopping a respectful distance from Thomas. He didn't puff out his chest. He didn't sneer. He looked at the empty space on the brick wall where the poster had been. Then he looked at Thomas, bowing his massive head slightly in a gesture of profound respect. "I was wrong," the giant said, his voice quiet and raspy. "About the science, about the philosophy, about him." He paused, swallowing hard. "I don't know how to anchor my mass. I don't know how to move. I thought I was a fighter, but I was just a bully with gravity on my side." Thomas remained silent, watching the man. "I want to learn," the giant asked, looking up. "Will you teach me?" Thomas looked at the humble giant, recognizing the total destruction of ego required to ask that question. The universe had delivered its lesson, and the student was finally ready to listen. Thomas unstrapped his gloves. "Take off your shoes. We start with your stance." The gym's rusted rafters witnessed a profound transformation, proving that arrogant mass inevitably falls to disciplined science. The viral knockout permanently shattered the giant's ego, delivering absolute, unyielding hard karma, while silently sparking an unexpected, dangerous romance from the shadows of the criminal underworld. Ultimately, true martial arts is not found in the destruction of an opponent, but in the humbled rebuilding of a broken spirit upon the mat.